Welcome. Thank you for dialing in, logging on. My name is Debbie Botwick, and I'm part of the marketing team for the ATD New York City chapter. A little bit more about the chapter. We're part of ATD National and serve approximately 380 talent and development professionals in the New York City area. And as part of our regular programming, we hold about 50 events a year, events that do things like profile CLOs, conduct panel discussions, and run workshops. Today's webinar is actually the first in a series of webinars that we're hosting with our sponsors. And our goal is to make these webinar sessions informative, engaging, and interactive for our attendees. And we're expecting to host about 5 to 6 additional webinars of this nature over the course of 2016. Before introducing our sponsors and getting the session started, I just want to share a few logistics. We have you all on mute, and we encourage you to use chat with each other throughout the presentation so that you can share your brilliance with each other as you're listening. To do that, in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you should see some icons at the top. Make sure that you click the chat icon, and when you're in the chat function, the panel will come up on the right-hand side. There's a drop-down in the chat function that's titled Send To. If you click on the little right arrow to the right in the drop-down dialog box and scroll all the way to the bottom, choose All Participants in that drop-down menu so that everyone can benefit from your sharing. In terms of questions, there's also a Q&A function, Q&A panel. So if you have questions that you specifically want our panelists, our presenters to answer, please use that Q&A panel to address those questions to the presenters. Though we are going to be having a Q&A session at the end, we will type those questions in as they come to you, and we'll get back to you at the end of the session with answers to the questions, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. And then lastly, I just want to let you all know that we are recording this session so that we can share it with a broader class of members at a later date. So I said this is a sponsor webinar, and our sponsor today is the Regis Company. And our session leads today are Diane Miller and Emily Ricci, who will be talking about Design for Thinking. Diane is the Director of Design Services for the Regis Company. She's passionate about driving learning effectiveness through the application of design and systems thinking. At Regis, she has spearheaded their mental model-driven design approach and their Agile Transformation Initiative, working across multiple client initiatives. Emily leads the Regis Company's design approach, champions the organization's design vision for executive leadership development, and has end-to-end ownership of several award-winning global milestone programs. Emily partners with clients to create solutions that change the behavior of senior executives across large global organizations. And with that, I will hand it off to Diane to begin.
Thank you, Debbie. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning for some of my colleagues who are dialing in from outside of the East Coast time zone. Thank you so much for inviting us to present at this webinar today. Emily and I are both really, really excited to share some of our learnings with you. As Debbie mentioned, we are the Regis Company. We're a talent development consultancy whose primary mission is to create great thinkers and leaders. As Emily and I began to work on this webinar, we realized that design thinking is really a very hot topic in learning these days, and that is in thanks, at least in part, to Josh Bersin's reference in his predictions for 2016 report. But what we have recognized is the framework for design thinking has been around for a really long time and has most recently been popularized by institutions and organizations such as IDEO, Stanford D School, Google, and others. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how we've adapted design thinking to learning environments to solve some of our clients' most pressing business and learning problems. And we want to share with you some of our lessons that we've learned and challenges to integrating design thinking in our own organization. So before we get started with our presentation, we would like to do a quick survey of the audience. And so, Debbie, if you'll open up the poll for us, please. We'd like to have a sense of if and how you all are using design thinking in your organization. So we'll give you a few minutes to respond to that poll, and then we'll get the results up. And Debbie, are we getting answers recorded as we go?
Sorry about that, Diana. I was on mute. We still have some answers coming in.
Okay.
So if you want to give it just another minute.
That sounds great.
Looks like a lot of energy around idea generation, brainstorming, and rapid prototyping and experimentation. And right now the third is we don't use design thinking. And the answers seem to be slowing down a bit, so I'm going to close the poll.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Debbie, would you mind summarizing those results again just for me? I don't have the closed poll on my screen.
Yes, it's thinking. It's going to take a couple of seconds, but you should be able to see it in just a minute.
Okay.
Okay, can you see that? So you can see idea generation and brainstorming and rapid prototyping have 8 each with 25%, followed by we don't use design thinking at 22% and needs assessments at 16%.
Great. So it sounds like many of you are beginning to dip your toe into using design thinking. And certainly the idea of using it for idea generation and brainstorming is one of the most frequent ways that we see design thinking being used in our organization. We actually also use design thinking pretty extensively for needs assessment, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. One of the things that Emily and I thought about as we created this poll is we actually threw a little bit of a curveball into this, because we actually believe that when you apply it consistently, design thinking actually enables all of these things. So certainly rapid prototyping and experimentation, idea generation are all key elements of design thinking, but we really have found that using design thinking from an end-to-end approach is helping us solve and articulate our clients' toughest challenges. So I want to talk about solving challenges for a little bit, and it's something I think that we all recognize that we're all pretty good at solving problems, and it's central to what we do every day. But one of the things we found at the Regis Company is that we are often asked to resolve pretty complex or pretty thorny challenges and issues that are oftentimes have roots deeper than what we can easily see. Some of these may resonate with you, but some of the challenges we've heard over time is, gosh, our leaders need to be able to think more strategically about the business. We need to be able to innovate more effectively to be more competitive in the marketplace. And we need our people to be better critical thinkers and problem solvers. And in a lot of cases, in fact, in all of these cases, we know that the solution isn't as simple as bringing an expert in to tell people you need to think more strategically, or providing them with a slick new performance management tool to enable that performance. We find that it's not uncommon that organizations engage in this type of solution, but we also find that a lot of times that only addresses the surface layer of the problem. And those approaches often lead to a Groundhog's Day, which leaves all of us as learning and development professionals having to address the same issues over and over again while wondering if the approach is going to stick. What we found is our focus on design thinking, which we really define as a scientific approach for breaking down complex challenges, has helped us sidestep some of these traps and come to solving complex performance problems more effectively. In the next 30 minutes or so, Emily and I are going to walk you through 4 rules that we have implemented in our organization for effective design thinking and why we believe they're going to help you achieve a deep understanding of your organization's performance issues and ultimately address the critical business issues that you face.
So that brings us to our first rule of design thinking, which is to create empathy for many users, because, believe it or not, you have more than one user. So in our organization, we have learned that performance solutions are often just about telling people how to think or how to perform differently. And then they're oftentimes given the opportunity to practice, but in a very prescribed environment. So before we started pushing our client conversations in a different direction through design thinking, we really rarely saw organizations trying to deeply understand the experiences their people were having as they encountered and addressed job challenges, just on a purely human level. So as we learned over time, in the human-centered design approach, that is exactly what you do. You engage very closely with the human beings at the center of the performance issue, which then leads you to a much richer and more effective result. So instead of asking just what results are important, we now also ask, who are the users? What experiences are they having every day? What biases do they hold? And perhaps how would they behave if they had experienced the problem or maybe the solution a little bit differently? So design thinking really helps us do this in a critical way because it generates empathy for the user. And we'll talk about how in just a moment. But this is why you'll often hear design thinking tightly coupled with the phrase human-centered design. So we're using the word users on purpose instead of learners. And you might be asking yourself, well, what is a user? Next slide, please. Before we speak more to our organization's deep focus on empathy, let's share how we define users. So a user, in our view, is very simply anyone who has something to lose or gain from a design. And that could be a good design or a bad design. So in conventional design, we find that organizations tend to use the word user and learner synonymously. And we think that this is a little bit of a mistake. But because organizations tend to know their people, they tend to speak on their behalf. And the problem with this is twofold. So first, while learning and development teams might be able to define the characteristics of a given learner population, speaking for them is never as good as actually talking to the learners themselves. So we'll discuss why in just a moment. But the idea here is that in design thinking, you don't want to just take someone's word for it. You want to actually connect with the user themselves. And the second part of this is with the definition of user, as I mentioned. So if we limit the meaning of this word just to learners, we're sort of examining them in a vacuum, and this puts us at risk for overlooking things like who affects their performance, who might challenge them, who they have to relate to on a day-to-day basis, and how, in general, their learning is enabled. So if we don't expand the definition to include some of these other users, that is ultimately going to affect the success of a program, and this can get us into trouble later on. So in effect, there isn't just a user, but instead there are multiple user personas. So in our organization, when we decided to start our initial discovery process by generating true user empathy, we started to discover that we were not only solving the right problem and better than we had, but in fact that we were solving them in ways that delivered more value than ever before. I'll give you a recent example of this. A large professional services firm approached us to redesign their new employee orientation program. And when we asked them about the existing program, they said things like, well, this program doesn't do a good enough job of selling our organization to new joiners. We want people to understand all the cool opportunities that will be available to them if they stay with us. And things like, our new employee orientation is completely dependent on the facilitator. Sometimes it's someone really dynamic and people are super charged up when they leave. And then other times, they're telling us that they're trying not to fall asleep. This is where we diverged from our client-suggested approach. So instead of asking for more data, which would have been totally illogical, We instead ask to talk to the users. And like Stanford D School, we call these empathy interviews. Empathy interviews involve a different set of questions than typical stakeholder interviews. And we'll just give you a brief taste of them in the interest of time today, but in our empathy interviews, we ask questions like, when friends or family ask you what you do, what do you tell them? And what things about your job did you have to learn the hard way? And how soon did you understand what it would take for you to succeed in the organization? Now, we had already, of course, heard what they liked or they didn't like from the perspective of the learning team, but we didn't know what the users themselves would say about their own experience, and this is a really important difference. Now, we also wanted to hear stories, because stories not only describe the problems, but also how people in the organization experience or engage with a particular problem. To uncover good stories, we typically begin with really simple, open-ended questions like, what happens when? What if? How do you know if? You know, really, really simple things, but open-ended questions that get people to tell a story that gives you the context of their issue. And these kinds of stories start helping us discern specific thought patterns, trade-offs, and systemic effects of desired and non-desired behaviors, which is a pretty important distinction.
So in this particular client example, we wound up with a lot of stories that surprised both our team and the client team. When we went back to the client and shared the stories, they had a bunch of aha moments where they realized that one of the issues that their new employees were facing was they were so focused on getting staffed on the right project and building the reputation and being billable that they were foregoing the opportunities to lay the groundwork for long-term success in the organization. And this led to a complete change in focus. I'm sorry, guys, I am having WebEx issues today. This led to a complete change in the design of the program. So rather than spending time thinking about how to sell the cool benefits of the program as they originally thought, we instead created a program in which we gave them opportunities to hear the expectations that were really on the table for them as new joiners in the organization. Those had to do with how anxious they should be about being billable or chargeable, or how soon they should be expected to make an effect on the business, to have an impact on the business's bottom line. We also gave them opportunities to think about how they would build their network, how they would create a long-term collection of colleagues and resources and groups that would help them become successful over time and not just be successful in the first 6 months of their career with that organization, but over the next 3, 5, or 10 years of that organization, of their tenure with that organization. And we gave them opportunities to think about how they were going to build their niche, how were they going to create their reputation. And when new employees left that orientation, they felt like they were much more prepared to deal with the realities of what was going to be coming up in the early part of their career, and much less anxious about, oh my gosh, I have to find a way to make an immediate impact on the organization's bottom line by getting staff to the right project.
So we know that we have emphasized this point a lot about empathy, but we do emphasize it because it's really central to understanding what's truly going on with the target population for a given solution, and as well as to human-centered design itself. When you understand your users, you have a much better understanding of what you need to do to be effective. And as a design thinking tactic, just try this instead of collecting more data. Diane?
Okay, so that brings us to the second rule that we have really begun to embrace as an organization, and that is to embrace divergence before convergence. We know the ability to quickly and creatively generate solutions is key to your team's success and your organization's success. But we also find that we have a natural human inclination to reach consensus that can really distract us from finding the best answers, especially when there's time pressure involved. The strength of this consensus bias, we find, often leads teams to embrace the first solution rather than the best solution. And I'm going to share paint a picture for you, and I'll ask you to think about if you've ever found yourself in this situation where you have been with your team, with your stakeholders, with your clients, and you get in a room together to do a traditional brainstorming or whiteboarding session to figure out a solution to a problem. And after hours of talking and sketching and drawing and going around the table, you finally reach agreement on one idea and everybody says, thank God, we're finally at a good stopping point, let's move forward. And sometimes you have moved forward with the idea that everybody has sort of settled on rather than the idea that you really believe is going to address the issues that you've got to deal with. At the Regis Company, we've learned that when we obey the desire to reach consensus and implement the first or second idea that we hear, we often find out later that we didn't have the best idea, and worse, many of these ideas can be overruled by late emerging stakeholders because they're not rooted in substantive thinking. When we find this happens, we note that there's a significant time, cost, and morale implication for the team to have to go back and revisit work and decisions that they think they've already made. Our approach to design thinking deliberately challenges this norm by inviting divergent thinking in at the outset. We focus early on ideating, not implementing, and we hold white space for lots of different ideas at the beginning of the process. When the goal is to efficiently and methodically eliminate what won't work early on, we find we're more effective later on and our money is better spent. Okay. I just made it sound really easy, but it's not. At this point in the process, Emily and I and those of us who are implementing design thinking in our organization are really comfortable with ambiguity and that feeling of not having settled on a single idea early in the process. But that doesn't always mean that our clients are or our teams are. And we find that that drive for certainty that we all have makes those gray areas of divergence feel really uncomfortable. We've had numerous experiences where we've had stakeholders say to us, can we just skip this divergence before convergence part and get to solutioning? And what we've found is that when we do that, again, we don't reach the best solution. So it's really important that we take a few steps up front to address those issues before they happen. One thing we do is we try and be very upfront about ambiguity that participants are going to experience when they engage with us. We prime a lot of our teams for cognitive discomfort by sending pre-work and painting a picture of the milestone. So they have a sense that the discomfort they're feeling now is getting them to a specific milestone. We also use a lot of structure in our sessions to generate ideas and set up opportunities for evaluation. That's very different from standard unstructured brainstorming, which oftentimes has the effect of just exhausting participants until they're ready to accept any idea in order to just move on. In short, what we found is it takes a lot of discipline and rigor to work through the ambiguity and reach a shared vision, but it's worth it in the end.
Now it's time for some practicality. How do you do this? How do you create divergence? Well, some of it is a little bit subtle and some are more obvious in our experience. And a few ways that we achieve design divergence with clients of the Regis Company and with our own internal teams for that matter include first interviewing a wide range of people. We're talking of different ranks, different tenures, and from different areas of the business, even if they won't be eventual learners. We want a nice rounded out perspective on what's really happening in and around a particular issue. Second, inviting a really broad group of people to engage in the design thinking sessions, not just the learning and development team. This can be kind of challenging given senior stakeholder schedules, But in the end, it's really worth it because it helps us to identify what the needs are for everybody as well as what the perspectives are, which really lines up nicely to the interviewing process. Next, actively inviting in vocal dissenters of the program or the process to participate. This seems a little bit counterintuitive, and it also might seem like something that you really don't want to do, but it's actually very valuable. It's valuable for two reasons. The first being that if you invite these people in early, you might convert them and they could become a very vocal advocate. But secondly, if they're going to continue not being fully on board with what you're doing, by inviting them in, at least you understand their opinion and you can account for it in the design of your program, which is a really great thing to be able to do. Next, structuring the design thinking exercises so that participants can silently generate their own ideas first before having to discuss them out loud. When we run design thinking workshops, we're doing a lot of what we call affinitizing, where everybody generates their own independent ideas and then we come back to them and collate as a group. This is really helpful because it gives people an opportunity to think on their own terms, for you to really harness the individual perspectives and to not get kind of caught up in that group thing that can sometimes happen, and Diane was speaking about earlier. Also, this helps us avoid the obeying the highest paid person in the room syndrome, which can sometimes happen, whereas everybody has their own ideas, but nobody really wants to share them because there's somebody much more senior to them there, and that person's opinion is the most important. So by having people generate their ideas independently, you really avoid this because it's part of the structure. Next, putting time limits on design thinking exercises so that the focus is on speed and not quality. It's not to say that quality isn't important, but quality comes later, and quality comes through the refinement that you will do once you get through the idea generation portion of the design thinking workshop. So by helping people respond to a time box, you're really helping them not be so critical of their own ideas. And we like quantity over quality, at least at the beginning, so we can get the broadest view possible and then start to refine from there. Not doing too much priming before an event itself. We don't like to tell people a whole lot about what we're going to do so that we can keep their individual biases to a minimum. So it's a balance here of giving people enough to have them be interested and have them understand why they're being asked to participate, and also not oversharing so that they feel like they have a preconceived notion about what you're going to do and might even come in with a little bit of resistance. So it's a fine balance there, and we try to err on the side of not priming them. And finally, active facilitation of design sessions by an independent facilitator. Someone who is not vested in the ultimate solution is really your best bet. And also somebody who is skilled in facilitating structured idea generation sessions and can feel really comfortable with all the ambiguity. If you have a facilitator who is either on the hook to deliver or is somebody who probably doesn't have a strong background in doing this, it's really easy to get swept up in the momentum or the energy of the room and to change the whole plan, and then you find at the end of it you didn't really get as far as you thought you would. So having an outsider do this can be very, very helpful. The moral of the story here is that divergence as a goal leads to lots of ideas, and lots of ideas lead to rich discussion, and rich discussion leads to uncovering hidden problems. And solving those problems, both hidden and not, leads to a good solution. And that really is the essence of divergence before convergence.
Thanks, Emily. Emily just talked about finding the problem, having the good discussion that leads to finding the problems, that leads to finding the solutions, and that really leads us to the third rule of design thinking, and that is that we want to focus on the problem, at least initially, rather than the solution. And that sounds almost counterintuitive because we are all about delivering a solution, but I'm going to share with you a story that we experienced working with a client that I think brings this issue to life, or this rule to life. We were working with a large organization that was going through some significant changes about 1.5 years ago in their business. And those changes had to do with expanding commercial and international markets, dealing with a number of government austerity programs, and a massive turnover movement in their workforce due to retirement. And some of you may find that some of those issues are resonating with you as well. The client had done a lot of work preparing for these changes and these events, and they had a robust competency model that they used to help prepare their future leaders. And one of the key criteria, or one of the key competencies in that model, was the ability to set a vision that would shape not only the future of the company, but also the future of the industry. And that model really relied heavily on innovative thinking, and really sort of set the standard that innovation and innovative thinking was the quality that was going to differentiate their people and enable them to successfully transition to the organization of the future. So they came to us to help them solve that problem. And while we have lots of experience creating solutions that help generate innovative or creative thinking, we really wanted to dig in a little bit more to that identified problem and speak with other leaders in the organization. When we did that and we really started to uncover what some of the real issues were, we found that while the organization was championing this idea of innovation and innovative thinking, the competency that was most currently valued in the organization wasn't innovation, it was risk management. And that dichotomy, or that dissonance, was creating a situation in which the desired behavior of the organization around risk management was working against the stated vision of the organization to create an innovative set of future leaders. And so when we finally created the solution for the organization, we were able to address not only this idea of needing to be innovative to meet the challenges of the new marketplace, but we were also able to address this old mental model, this old way of thinking about risk management as paramount to being an effective leader in the organization. If we hadn't taken the time to uncover that dissonance, we would have created a really fun and exciting program focused on innovation, but we would have been solving for the wrong problem. And that really would have ended up being a big problem, not just for us, but for our organization and our clients as well. So oftentimes when we engage with a client, they have a certain problem they know exists, and they have a lot of data to back that up, and they have already engaged in some thinking about what they want the solution to be or what the solution should be. When we engage with a client at that level, of course we don't disregard their insights. We think that they have a lot of valuable information about what's going on in the organization. But what we've learned is when we accept that fact, we can find that there are more issues that come to bear on the problem when we move into development, and that has implications for time and cost. So when we do our design thinking workshops, we instead work through a series of activities that help us make sure we're solving the right problem. Our design thinking exercises lead us to ask questions like, what assumptions are we making about our learners and the organization, or our users in the organization? Do we have beliefs about what's driving their behavior that might not be accurate? What are some things we know for sure about learners, the organization, and the behavior and the interaction of the two? We spend a lot of time trying to tease out those facts and assumptions, and as you can imagine, that's difficult, but it's really valuable. We want to talk about the behavior that's causing the problem, either individual or organizational, and we really want to understand what that looks like from an observable basis. What do people experience as a result of that behavior? Conversely, we want to also know what good looks like and what good behavior looks like. So while competency models are really valuable for us in understanding what's important to the organization, we really want to dig in and say, well, what does innovation look like in your organization? Because it might look very different in a large established organization versus a lean startup. we want to ask what we should be prioritizing. As you know, as learning leaders and development professionals, there's always another problem to be solved. And so we want to make sure that we're not boiling the ocean, that we're really focusing in on the problems and the solutions that are going to have the greatest effect and impact. What do we know about the learners, and how do what we know about the learners affect our design implications? So if you've been reading publications these days, you know that there's a lot of information out about the millennial generation. If, for example, we're not taking into account the fact that 80% of our learner population are millennials, we might really be missing some important aspects that we need to build in our design to engage those learners and make the learning effective. What do the learners feel about the solution? This goes back a little bit to what we talked about, empathy, but how will learners feel when they engage in the solution? Are they going to feel overwhelmed with the thought of how am I ever going to remember all of this? Are they going to feel challenged by the fact that, gosh, this is a daunting problem to solve? Or are they going to feel confident that, yes, it might be challenging, but that they have the skills to really address and overcome those? And this all really leads us to answering the question, what problem are we going to be trying to solve for the organization and for the learners? To sum up, what we really are saying with this rule of focusing on the problem is we want to make sure that we're building the right thing early on so that later on we can make sure we're building the thing right. But starting with a focus on the right problem to solve before you move forward to actually solving it, we find is really a non-negotiable rule of design thinking as we engage with our clients.
And that brings us to our fourth and final rule, which is co-create to reach a shared vision, because creating together makes everything better. By this, we mean work side by side in a design thinking session, co-creating work products with the broader team. And in its essence, that also means that everyone in the room participates, even if it's not their domain, even if they aren't on the hook for delivery, even if they can only be there for an hour, everyone participates so that both teams can converge on a shared vision. So at the Regis Company, we found that our client partnerships that have the goal of co-creating a solution are easily the most successful, both from a relationship management and a product development standpoint. But introducing the idea of co-creation can sometimes be tricky for us when we are the consultants. And if you're working with the clients or an internal team, you might experience something similar. After all, when we're hired as consultants, we're effectively paid to come in and deliver an expert opinion. And you might face this same challenge when you're on an internal team. You're meant to deliver the solution, not ask team members to do work. So when you change the dynamic and ask your client or your team to work alongside you, they might be resistant or even openly question your methods. So setting expectations for the co-creation process is really, really important. And again, having a strong facilitator who can work through the ambiguity and challenge can also be really useful. How do we do this in our organization? Well, there are a number of ways to enable effective co-creation. First, you've heard us say this before, but we'll reiterate it here, invite the right people to be a part of the process. And even though it might seem uncomfortable, it's even more critical to invite people who might have even different perspectives on the problem and the solution than what you think they should be. You really want to avoid a situation where you have this stakeholder in the grass emerging after your design is already baked. And when this happens, all of your efforts can really be derailed, and then it becomes expensive and time-consuming and a bit demoralizing to make changes to the design. Next, don't overvalue an expert opinion. Remember that while one party in the process might seem to have all the answers, the goal is to have everyone involved in the solution to understand the same things at the same time. And this requires collaboration, but that's how you get to a shared vision. And it also comes back to that idea of making everyone's contributions valued and not only listening to the highest paid person in the room. Their opinions and ideas are certainly very valuable, but we know from experience that good design can come from anywhere and from anybody. Next, set ground rules for working together. So establish what will make you successful and expectations around contributions to your process. When we set up a design thinking session, we have a number of rules that we like to abide by, and they might look different in your organization, but have an open chat about what you're going to, what constitutes success for you, and what are your rules for working together so that everybody knows how to get to your goal. Next, ask the same question many times, but in a slightly different way. We often have to prepare our teams that this is going to happen, or else the reaction can be, didn't you hear me when I answered that question the first time? But when you do it deliberately, you'll determine what a group agrees on a lot faster than if you put all of your eggs in one basket by saving your central questions until the very end. So determine what those questions are. For example, what problem are we solving? And keep asking those questions until you're sure that everyone is really on the same page. Push your group to get to a working vision for the solution much sooner than you think they are ready. After all, it is much better to reject something half-baked on paper than fully baked in real life. And you want to find ways to test out small aspects of the vision with your audience. So this could take the form of a paper design flow, or maybe a wall full of sticky notes that you take a photo of, or even an online wireframe. But get your ideas into even an ugly visual format as soon as you can so that you can begin determining what will work and what won't. Your group will have a much easier time coming to a shared vision this way. Very closely related is using available tools to gather opinions as your design vision emerges. So we like to use electronic surveys at the Regis Company to test out how well our ideas might be received in the target population. And this is when the design is maybe kind of at an early stage of creation. But use whatever is available to you when you think you have a working vision. Maybe it's just email or PowerPoint or focus group or whatever you can get together. But try to use some tools to test out some of your assumptions. And finally, don't assume that once you achieve this shared vision that your work is done. It's really easy to diverge over time, and those very small deviations can grow quickly. This is another compelling reason why you want to make sure that you have all your stakeholders assembled as much as possible, because they can often introduce the deviations that you weren't prepared for. So know that even in the best of circumstances, your design really is a living thing, and it's going to continue to evolve. So come back to the vision often with your team, and just make sure that everyone understands how the refinements will affect the end result. In summary, for co-creation, it can be challenging because it can feel really different from what your clients or your internal teams are used to, but it is worth it. When you have two teams that are working together for a couple of hours or even a couple of days creating work product together, it doesn't just mean that they're good partners with you. It means that both of the teams are understanding the same information at the same time. So enabling convergence in this way helps both teams reach that shared vision, which will ultimately make your project that much more successful.
Thanks, Emily. So Emily and I have presented you with what we believe are 4 rules for effective use of design thinking in our organization and as we work with our client organizations. So we're just going to take a minute to summarize those briefly before we close. Rule number 1, and I really can't emphasize this enough, is to create empathy for many users. We really have come to realize at the Regis Company that we're not just creating learning solutions, we're creating experiences for people. We're creating experiences for learners, for facilitators, for stakeholders, for entire organizations. And we want to understand how they're going to engage in those experiences so that we can really create something that is not just instructionally sound or instructionally rigorous, which is of course important, but it really resonates with them, for them, at the particular point in their career or their organizational life cycle. The second rule we talked about is to embrace divergence before convergence. And to be really honest, we've learned this lesson, I think, multiple times and sometimes the hard way. What we found is if we don't involve divergence, or if we don't embrace divergence and invite divergence into the process early on at the beginning, if we don't ask for vocal dissent, we get it later on in the process anyway. So we've kind of taken, if you can't beat them, join them approach, but we found that it has really enabled us to get to better solutions faster in the long run.
Next, focus on the problem and not the solution. We know we're going to get to the solution, but in order to do so effectively, we have to be able to clearly identify what problem are we solving and how can we maintain our focus on that problem instead of just working toward a desired outcome. So we'd encourage you to focus on the problem and not the solution. And I would also echo Diane's comments here and say that we've learned this one the hard way as well, so please benefit from, from our struggle. And know that by asking the hard questions, the questions that are going to drive to the deeper challenges that are below the surface layer are going to get you to a better solution anyhow. And finally, co-create to reach a shared vision. Get everybody in the room together and have them work side by side as you work through your design thinking exercises, rather than a handoff situation where a couple people are working and then they throw it over the wall to somebody else. There's a very different outcome when people work together side by side so that they can have the same shared vision. We want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A, so we'll close here by saying that we really hope the ideas that we presented today will help you think about you or your client organization's problems just slightly differently. And we'd like to leave you with a challenging question, and perhaps that question could even be the opening to the Q&A session. And our challenge is, how will you use design thinking in your organization? So we'd like to begin the Q&A by collecting your answers to that question and any that have appeared on the chat. Marshall and Debbie, can you describe how you'd like to collect and answer questions for the Q&A?
Sure, Marshall here. I have a few questions that have come up during the session, so I can read them to you and let you all take them. And in the meantime, if other people have questions that you'd like to add, just you can put them in the chat, and then we will tackle them. So one of the questions we had was, Diane and Emily, is it ever valuable to exclude stakeholders from the divergence process? So that was one of the questions we had.
Ooh, that's a juicy question. Diane, I actually want to hear what you would say to us. So I'll let you take it first.
Well, never one to shy away from a challenge. I would say no. I wouldn't exclude stakeholders from the divergent process. I think when you're working on that ideation and that really deliberate, let's put all the ideas out on the table and evaluate them, I think it's important to have those stakeholders there. I think the container that we set around their participation is really valuable. There's a lot of different ways to structure input from multiple participants so that you do eliminate or mitigate that highest paid person opinion in the room. I think I've seen sessions, and I've been part of sessions where you might have, you know, a dozen stakeholders and one or two poor, lonely target audience members, and they feel kind of overwhelmed at that point in time. So what I really try and do is strike a balance between those two, so that my stakeholders are involved, but that they're not overwhelming the rest of the participation. So Emily, that's how I would approach it, but I'm interested in your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I agree. I would say even though it can be daunting, having them in the room is much better than not, because you're going to get their opinion anyway. So if you can get them in the session and have them contribute and have their own ideas be shaped by the process, that's a much better spot to be. I would also like to expand on the point that Diane made about the container. So when we have very, very senior stakeholders, especially, we try to target their involvement really carefully so that they're only contributing where they believe their time is well spent. We want to honor that, and we want to give them the sense that they are contributing in a valuable way to their own team as well, not just the process. So there are lots of different agenda structures that you can use to accommodate various stakeholder needs, and we have made a variety of accommodations for different stakeholders along the way. Great question.
Yeah, actually, there's one more point I do want to, Marshall, there's one more point I do want to make to that, and that is, while I would never exclude a stakeholder from a divergence or an ideation session, I also would not ask a stakeholder to participate in a session unless they also participated in some of that, in some upfront ground or level setting around empathy, and what did their team members or their reports say about the problem, so that stakeholder has similar information to what I have walking into a session.
Great. We have a question from Chennai Jackson. The question is, what questions are good to ask leaders to challenge their thinking appropriately in order to open them up to new ideas? I feel like I deal a lot with traditionalists.
I would say the questions, that's a good thought, and I will noodle on that for a moment, but my immediate response to that is it's not just the questions that you ask to provoke a certain response. I think we have a lot of success in the vehicle in which the questions are asked. So instead of maybe asking a question to a group in the design thinking workshop and having them answer, instead what we do is we provide some structure for an exercise and say, this is the problem that we're going to unpack now, and we're going to walk through it stage by stage. So as an example, a senior stakeholder might want to know, well, what is the solution going to look like? They want to come in and be able to design it. So what we do is we encourage them to get engaged with a user journey, and we ask first, well, if I'm creating what my user experience looks like from scratch, what are the stages of the experience? And then what are the goals of the experience? And then what are the tasks of this experience? What are the tools? And so on and so forth. So that we are, in effect, answering or asking them a tough question. We're getting an answer to a question that they want to have answered, but we're doing it in a way that creates buy-in, that creates the shared vision, and that gets them looking at things in a slightly different way. So as an immediate response, I would say that the emphasis is less on the questions and more on the vehicle, at least as it pertains to a co-located design thinking session. Diane, what would you add?
I would also suggest, senior stakeholders like data. At least my stakeholders like data, so they want to know why I'm not only what I'm recommending, but why I'm recommending it. And oftentimes we come with just reams of data about learner surveys and performance review surveys, and all of the data is really quantitative. And I think it's really useful to come with qualitative data. Like I said, those stories of what people are going to experience. I shared with you that professional service organization new joiner program, and they were I think they had a really good idea of what they wanted to accomplish, but I did an interview with one of their users, and this stuck with me, and she said, I know what I need to do, I just don't know how to be successful. And when we came back and we shared that with the organization and they heard that story, that put them in a different place about engaging with their participants. So think about the data that you're bringing to the table as you're making those asks to do things a little differently.
All right, time for one last question, and this might be a doozy, so we'll try it out though. So the question from Nicole Roy Tobin is, how will we use, I believe you mean, how will we use design thinking to rethink and ultimately redesign the development journey for the modern learner? You want to tackle that one, ladies?
That's the question of the year, Nicole. No, it's a
oh,
great
okay, sorry. No, Nicole, hold on. Nicole said that was a response to her question, so you're off the hook. Phew.
Although that would be a wonderful question to really explore. Maybe that's the subject for another webinar, part 2.
That's her response to the challenge. So that's what she's going to do. So Nicole has taken up the challenge. She's going to use design thinking to rethink and redesign the development journey for the modern learner. I think that's a nice way for us to wrap things up. What do you think?
I think that's great.
So I'll just share a couple things. So everyone, I've been jumping in here. My name is Marshall Bergman, and I run the New York office for the Regis Company. So thank you all for joining. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be part of ATD and be part of a group of people that are transforming learning experiences for learners across all sorts of organizations. I'm really pleased. By the way, we do have an opportunity. I don't know if any of you will be attending ATD National, but if you want, and you will be there, Diane will be there, and you can meet her in person. She's doing a session with Dr. Grace Chang, who's our cognitive neuroscience on the Regis team, called Changing How People Think to Optimize Team Performance. So if you're there, Monday, May 23rd at 1 p.m., please say hi to Diane. And we also have another session from the head of our analytics group, Andy Tanner, and Dr. Grace Chang and Michael Kester, going beyond ROI, using learning metrics to inform business strategy. So if we get a chance to meet you in person, please mention that that you saw this webinar, and we look forward to seeing you at those sessions as well. And last but not least, as I've mentioned, as Diane and Emily mentioned, the Regis Company is a talent development consulting firm, and we are focused on developing great thinkers and leaders. So we hope to get the chance to meet you and get the chance to let you know more about our organization. We have capabilities in a whole broad variety. So we work with our clients in design thinking, obviously, neuroscience, experiential leadership development programs, simulations, and also data analytics and measuring learning. So if you'd like to connect directly with Diane or Emily, you've got their contact information right here, and we encourage you, please email us directly if you have questions, you want some additional clarification. We'd love to start a conversation with you. Or if you just have more general questions about Regis or some talent development problems that you might think that we might be able to help you solve, please contact me. You've got all of our contact information there, and it is available for you. So without further ado, thank you all for joining us. We'll end this right on time. And also, thanks to the tireless team of ATD for putting this on. This was a great experience for us. And Debbie, thank you so much for making it all happen. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Marshall. And on behalf of ATD, if I could just ask everyone on the line to take a quick moment. In the chat, I posted a link that will take you to the ATD New York City website where you can provide some feedback. We're always trying to improve the sessions that we deliver, and so we would value your feedback. And the link should also pop up when we close out the WebEx session. So if you don't get it in chat, you'll get it then, but please do give us your feedback. We thank you for joining us, whether you're part of our chapter or not, and we hope to see you at the next webinar. Have a great day, everybody.